Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 3 of our Understanding International Relations lectures. We will have a look today at classical realism that emerged at the very end of the interwar period that we saw last week, and that became the prevailing approach within the discipline of international relations during the two first decades of the Cold War. So we saw last week that during the interwar period, the first generation of international relations scholars, mainly British idealists, were driven by the desire to contribute to peace. That is to say, they undertook an academic analysis of international politics in order to be politically useful, in order to contribute to change the world, to improve the world, to prevent a new world war from breaking out. They were reformists, driven by what we may call a normative or a practical, pragmatic interest. Their aim was not merely, their purpose was not merely to describe how international relations took place, not merely to explain why international politics occurred the way it occurred. They also wanted to change the state's behavior in order to give peace a chance. Unfortunately for them, however, the optimism was belied by the empirical reality. Only three major powers of the seven then prevailing powers were democratic states. Free trade admittedly prevailed during the 20s, but the Great Depression of 1929 put an end to free trade, and what's more, the League of Nations, supposed to maintain peace thanks to the collective security system that it established, was perfectly unable to prevent fascist Italy from invading Abyssinia or Ethiopia. It did not prevent Japan from attacking China. It did not prevent Hitler from remilitarizing the left bank of the Rhine River, from invading and annexing Austria, from attacking Czechoslovakia and Poland, thus provoking the outbreak of World War II. So the fact that the idealist ideas, claims, believes that it would be possible to reform, to change international politics, explains, and it was the last point we saw last week, why during the 30s, some scholars ended up rejecting idealism and its practical normative objectives. I mentioned Frederick Schumann, the American Frederick Schumann, the American Reinhold Niebuhr, and also I referred to Edward Carr. So let's have a look at Edward Carr, the most important founding father of realism before realism became predominant mainly in the US. Edward Carr published his book, The 20 Years Crisis, 1919-1939, 2 or 3 weeks before World War II broke out. And this introduction to international relations, this is the subtitle of his book, constituted a very harsh attack against idealists. Why? Because according to Carr, idealists committed a mistake to undertake a research driven much more by their wishful thinking, their desire to change the world, than by the study of what the reality really existed in. Listen to Carr's critique of idealism. The passionate desire to prevent war determines the whole initial course and direction of the idealist's study of international relations. Like other infant sciences, the science of international politics has been markedly and frankly utopian or idealist in the pejorative meaning of the term. In this initial stage, wishing prevails over thinking, generalization over observation. Remember the definition of theory: to observe reality and to explain reality. A little attempt is made at the critical analysis of the existing facts. Attention is almost exclusively on the end to be achieved. So Carr accused idealists to be driven by wishful thinking, just as in the past. Alchemy, for instance, was driven by the desire to transform various metals into gold, which by definition is impossible. So once he had criticized what he considered to be the limits, the flaws of idealism, Carr proposed his own approach. And his own approach, he will call it realism. Realism, why? Because precisely he thought that international relations scholars should take into account the reality as it is and not as we would like it to be. To some extent, Edward Carr rediscovers Machiavelli, who was the first political philosopher, the political thinker at the very beginning of the 16th century during the Italian Renaissance period, to also emphasize the necessity of theorists to take into account reality as it is and not as we would like it to be. Realism, I quote, places its emphasis on the acceptance of facts. The aim of the scientific study of international relations is to look at the facts, to study their causes, and to study their consequences. The function of thinking is to study a sequence of events which it is powerless to influence or to alter, to change. So the reality exists outside the observer, the scientific observer of this reality. What then does the reality of international politics consist in? Look at the last sentence in the quote of this slide. Politics are, in one sense, always power politics. Politics are always power politics. This is the core claim of the realist approach of politics in general and of international politics or international relations. More specifically, international politics are always synonymous with power politics. In the history of the discipline of international relations, Edward Carr's book, The 20 Years Crisis, constitutes the first major turning point, since it paved the way for the decline, the definitive decline of idealism and the rise of realism as the major theory after World War II. The decline of realism occurred as early as at the end of the 1930s because of the outbreak of World War II, and the rise of realism became irresistible after the end of World War II, at the very beginning of the Cold War. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a look at the historical background characterized by the outbreak of the Cold War after the end of World War II. We will first look at this historical background, and then we will have a detailed look at the analysis of the realist approach, since this analysis, since this theory was influenced by the historical context of the Cold War. The expression Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, you may know this, was put forward, was proposed first by George Orwell, the British novelist, but in the context different than the confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans. This confrontation was at the core of the definition put forward by Bernard Barak, an advisor of Roosevelt, and it was then spread and diffused by the journalist Bob Swope and Otto Lippmann, an American expert, an American pundit. The Cold War designates, of course, the competition, the rivalry of political, ideological, military, and economic nature, opposing the Americans to the Soviets. the American camp to the Soviet bloc, roughly from 45, 46, up to 1989 or 1991, the end of the Cold War, can be ascribed to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89, or to the definitive collapse of the USSR 2 years later in 1991. This Cold War, historically speaking, can be divided into three periods of high tensions, of recurring crises, and in three periods of dialogue, of kind of cooperation between the two superpowers. And these periods of dialogue, of course, separated or followed, as regards the last one, the periods of high tension. So regarding the periods of high tensions, the first one starts in 1946 and lasts up to 1953, 1946. We'll come back to this. The two speeches held by Stalin and by Churchill, the Iron Curtain speech, 53, the death of Stalin. And this period includes the communist coup in Prague in 1948, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin blockade in 48-49, and the airlift staged by the Americans. Mao's arrival to power, China became communist on October the 1st, 1949. This period also includes the Korean War that started in 50 and lasted up to 53, some weeks after, up to some weeks after the end, after the death of Stalin. The second period of high tension, 6 years going from 56 to 62, 56, the double crisis of Budapest, when the Hungarian attempt to get rid of the Soviet regime was repressed by the Soviet tanks, and the Suez Crisis, 1956, too, opposing the British and the French allied to the Israelis, opposed to Nasser, Egypt. This period includes the Second Berlin Crisis, which will end up in the construction, the building of the Berlin Wall. And this second period of high tensions comes to an end with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The last period of high tensions will characterize the end of the 70s and the beginning, the first half of the 1980s. 1978, the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Solidarnosc episode in Poland, the so-called Euro missile crisis, beginning of the 80s, which was called the Little Cold War. And this period of high tension will come to an end with Gorbachev becoming the new Secretary General of the Communist Party of the USSR in 1985. So these three periods of high tensions are separated by three periods of dialogue between the two major powers. A first period of dialogue followed the death of Stalin in 53 and lasted up to 56, when Khrushchev became the new Secretary General of the Communist Party of the USSR. This period is called the thaw. The second period starts with the end, the peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll come back to the Cuban Missile Crisis now. Next chapter, chapter 4. It will start in 1962 and last up to the second half of the 1970s. It includes America's war in Vietnam, launched by Kennedy and waged by Johnson and then by Nixon. It includes the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet tanks in 1968. The Soviets put an end to the Prague Spring, which attempted to change the regime, the communist regime. The Helsinki Conference on Cooperation and Security in Europe took place in 1975. In 1975, the US definitely lost its war in Vietnam, and from 76, 78, during the years 76, 78, the Soviets intervened in the former colonies of Portugal in Southern Africa to support the emerging communist regimes. The last period of dialogue started with Gorbachev coming to power in 1985. Reagan, who had called the USSR the evil empire, accepted to negotiate with Gorbachev. This permitted a disarmament, a nuclear disarmament process to start. And this period, of course, comes to an end with the end itself of the Cold War, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, or 1991, the collapse of the USSR. So 45 years or so of both periods of tensions and periods of dialogue. To understand the links between this background and the realist theory that will emerge immediately after the end of World War II, and to understand the success of realism, we have to understand when and where the Cold War started and why it lasted that long. That is to say, we have to describe it, to identify the outbreak of the Cold War. Description is the first objective of a scientific theory, and we have to understand the causes, permitting us to explain, to understand why the Cold War lasted 4.5 long decades. Scientific theories ask why questions. Their aim is to understand and to explain why things occur the way they occur. So when did the Cold War start? There are various events, various landmark events, of course, that should be emphasized. Two speeches, first of all, in 1946, February 9, 1946, Stalin held his Bolshoi speech, where he opposed the communist world of the USSR to the capitalist world. This is his expression, of course, to the capitalist world of Western Europe and the United States. And he considered that there could be no peace between these two opposed worlds. Why? Because of the capitalist system, which, according to him, is synonymous with aggressive behavior. The capitalist system, I quote, of world economy conceals elements of a crisis and war. So we communists, sooner or later, will have to wage a war against these aggressively behaving capitalists. The development of world capitalism proceeds, I quote, through crises and catastrophes. So sooner or later, in Stalin's vision, a war will oppose the West to the East, the capitalist system to the socialist or communist world. And this first speech by Stalin was followed by a speech by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, who was no longer the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He had been defeated in 1945. The Labour Party of Clement Attlee had won these elections. So what did Churchill do? He traveled around the world and gave lectures. And he gave a lecture at the University of Missouri in Fulton, where he held what will be known as the famous Iron Curtain speech. And this is what he said. Now listen to Churchill on March 5, 1946, so roughly 4 weeks after Stalin's speech, from Stettin in the Baltic. Stettin is nowadays in Poland. It had been formerly a German city. Anyway, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, the Italian city close to Yugoslavia. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. And behind that line, all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. These famous cities and their populations around lie in what I, Churchill, must call the Soviet sphere. So there is a Soviet sphere separated from the Western countries, the Iron Curtain speech. So these two speeches, to some extent, triggered the mutual mistrust between the two camps, and mainly between the Americans and the Soviets. There were also some political decisions and some political actions which contributed to aggravate the mistrust or the rivalry. First of all, in 1947, the USSR created the Comintern, that is to say, the Communist Information Agency, whose aim was to spread communist ideas beyond those countries that the Red Army had liberated and was occupying in Eastern Europe. The Comintern was a successor organization of the Comintern, which was the international communist movement that Stalin had put an end to during World War II in order to transform this world into what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. In 1947, too, the US adopted the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, also called the Containment Doctrine, influenced by an American diplomat, George Kennan, who was a diplomat in the American embassy in Moscow, who also called himself Mr. X when he published an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs, 1947. So the aim of the Americans was to contain, to stop the Soviets, to prevent them from going further than there where they had arrived when they liberated Eastern and Central Europe from Hitler. Very concretely, this containment doctrine was put into practice by Truman in Greece. In Greece, 1947, a civil war broke out, opposing the pro-Western Greek government to a communist guerrilla. And the communist guerrilla was, of course, sponsored and supported by the Soviets. So the Americans intervened in order to permit the pro-Western government to prevail, that is to say, to prevent Greece to become a new communist state. The USSR, what did the USSR do? Seeing that the US intervened in Greece, it decided to definitely dominate all those Eastern European states that had been liberated by the Red Army. The USSR incited the communist parties in Eastern Germany, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, etc., to adopt the so-called salami tactics. That is to say, the communists managed to gain the power slice by slice. They got rid of the different non-communist parties that had been part of the very first governments after the end of World War II. That is to say, the general anti-fascist or anti-Nazi parties, the peasant parties, and then the socialist or social democratic parties. Only the Communist Party remained, thus transforming these states into communist dictatorships, the dictatorship of the proletarians, if we should use the Marxist expression. The last of these communist coups occurred in Prague, Czechoslovakia, in February 1948. And last but not least, in 1948, the US adopted its Marshall Plan to reconstruct the economy of Europe, the economy that had been destroyed, of course, by World War II. The Americans went as far as proposing this Marshall Plan even to Eastern European countries, which was perceived as a kind of provocation, of course, by the Soviets. So a kind of a chain reaction of speeches and actions which ended up in transforming the initial mistrust into a definitive rivalry opposing the Soviets to the Americans. Where did the Cold War start? It started, of course, in Europe, in Central Europe, because of the so-called German question. Germany, ever since the 17th century, was perceived as a rival by the French on the one hand, by the Russians on the other. So the question was how to control Germany after World War II, also in order to prevent a new revanchist Germany to emerge, just as had been the case after World War I, when Hitler tried to once again dominate the world after the failure of Imperial Germany in 1914, 1918. The Cold War also started to some extent in the Far East. You know that the Americans launched 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their explanation was the following one: we bomb Japan with our nuclear weapons in order to put an end to this war, because if we have to land, if we have to send our troops, our GIs, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people will die. So it's a lesser evil to some extent to launch these bombs. The Soviets did not accept this explanation. They thought that the Americans launched this bomb in order to put an end to the war, thus preventing the Soviets from landing, notably in the Dono part of Japan. Maybe you know that the USSR declared war to Japan very, very late in World War II, that is to say 1945 only. And to some extent, the Cold War also broke out in the Middle East. The Soviets were eager to control the Black Sea Straits, that is to say the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits. They also wanted to control the oil fields of North Iran, thanks to the communists in that region. And oil, of course, was a very high stake for the British and for the Americans. So to sum up this first point, ladies and gentlemen, regarding the descriptive dimension of the start of the Cold War, the world gradually became divided, geographically divided. Europe, the Far East, the Middle East became zones of rivalry opposing the Soviets to the Americans, and the whole world thus was transformed into a bipolar system with 2 major powers, the US and the USSR, and their respective allies or satellites. This bipolar confrontation lasted more than 4 long decades. And to understand then the reasons or the causes of why the Cold War lasted that long, we have to look beyond the immediate triggering events. We have to look at the structural or fundamental causes of the Cold War. The best way here to proceed, ladies and gentlemen, is, I think, to resort to Kent Waltz's model of analysis. In his book, Man, the State and War, you have the title on the slide, published in 1959, Kenneth Waltz claimed that in order to account for international political events, we have to look at the causes, and these causes can be located at 3 different levels of analysis. This is what he calls the 3 images. The first image is the individual actor level of analysis. The second image is the collective actor of analysis. And the third image is the system level of analysis. So let's look at the first image. That is to say, let's look at the causes that contributed to the outbreak of the Cold War, the causes that are located at the individual actor level of analysis. At the individual actor level of analysis, the important factors that permit us to explain why the Cold War broke out and why it lasted that long, the factors concerned relate to the statesmen, the individuals themselves. That is to say, their convictions, their beliefs, their personality, their psychology, their perception, as you say, how they perceived the then prevailing reality. And regarding these perceptions, what we should emphasize, I think, is that the American and the Soviet leaders had very different perceptions of the then prevailing reality. The Soviet leaders had witnessed, of course, the occupation of the USSR by the Nazis and the destruction of the Soviet economy, not to mention the 20 million people that were killed during World War II. So for the Soviet leaders, it was normal. They considered to be normal to do what? To dismantle the industrial plants in those countries that the Red Army had liberated and whose regimes pretty often had collaborated with Hitler. If the Soviet was to rebuild these industrial plants in the Soviet Union to permit the Soviet economy to restart, and it was for them normal, it was a defensive move. The American perception, however, was completely different. Why? Because America's economy had not suffered during World War II. It actually had prospered. So the Americans considered the Soviet decision to dismantle the industries in Eastern Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, etc., and to rebuild them in the Soviet Union. They considered this decision to be the proof of the desire of the Soviets to dominate the Eastern European countries. All the more so the Americans themselves gave the Marshall Plan to the Europeans. The perception of the Americans was the following one: we have to rebuild very quickly the destroyed economies of West Europe, because during the interwar period, the economic crisis, the Great Depression of 1929, had contributed to the rise of far right-wing regimes. So if we want this if we do not want this to happen once again, we have to rebuild the Western economies and we have to help them. The Soviets, however, did not perceive the Marshall Plan in the same way. They considered it as the evidence of America eager to dominate Western Europe. So you see that the two perceptions are somehow opposed. Both the Americans and the Soviet leaders were tempted to take a black and white view of each other's actions, a Manichaean view. That is to say, the Soviets and the Americans considered themselves to be guided by the very best intentions, and they accused the other to be motivated by the worst possible intentions. And these perceptions, which actually were somehow misperceptions, the term is due to Robert Jervis, perception and misperception in international politics. We'll come back to Jervis also in our chapter 4. These misperceptions ended up transforming themselves into self-fulfilling prophecies. Self-fulfilling prophecies. What is the meaning of this term? Look at 1949, when the Americans and Western Europeans created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The aim of the Americans, of the French, of the British, of the Dutch, of the Italians, was to establish a military alliance in order to defend themselves against what they perceived to be a Soviet threat, a communist threat. 49. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, of course, with the authorization both of Mao and of Stalin. So the Western Europeans and the Americans came to the conclusion we were right to establish NATO. If we had not established NATO as a defensive alliance, the Soviets would have attacked Western Europe rather than asking North Korea to invade South Korea. So the perception transforms into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And of course, the Soviets have exactly the opposite analysis of the situation. When the Americans and the Western Europeans created NATO, the Soviets drew the following conclusion: we were right to maintain our Red Army in Eastern Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, because otherwise NATO would have included these countries and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be at our Soviet border. This is also the argument of Putin, explaining why he wants to control, at least indirectly, what happens in Ukraine, because he does not want Ukraine to be part nowadays, to be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So you see the perceptions which then create realities, thus becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. These perceptions and misperceptions, of course, created and aggravated the mistrust, the absence of confidence between the two opposed powers, the Soviets and the Americans. Of course, these perceptions and actually misperceptions were related to the underlying ideology of the two major powers. And we thus come to the second image, or the collective actor level of analysis. The Cold War, from this perspective, can be analyzed as an ideological rivalry, an ideological competition between, on the one hand, the democratic camp led by the US, and on the other, the communist camp or bloc led by the Soviet Union. The socialist Soviet Union, on the one hand, the liberal democratic United States of America, were to some extent bound to be adversaries, doomed to become rivals because of their political, ideological opposition. The aim of the Soviet Union was to spread communism, and the aim of the US was to spread freedom or capitalism. Washington considers that communism only can expand through war, and therefore Washington must contain the communist expansionist ambition. The communists believe that the end of history will be a classless society, so communism will triumph sooner or later, and therefore they must fight against the capitalists in order to somehow accelerate the pace of history towards the classless communist society. So to sum up, this second point, the explanation located at the second image, the collective actor level of analysis, the Cold War was, to quote Remoron, whom I already quoted last week, was a heterogeneous system. There were two major powers and two camps or blocs appealing to contradictory values, organized according to incompatible principles: socialism, communism on the one hand, collective economy, on the other hand, private economy, freedom, and plural liberalism. This heterogeneous nature of the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, of course, cannot be separated from the third image, the system level of analysis, that is to say, the power distribution or the power configuration that characterized the post-World War II world. If we want to explain why the Cold War lasted that long, we have to take to account the power political rivalry and not merely the ideological competition between the Soviets and the Americans. As a matter of fact, and you know that, after 1945 emerged a new unprecedented system or power configuration or power structure. The traditional European powers that had dominated the world during 4, if not even 5 centuries, first Spain and then France, and then Great Britain, and even to some extent the Dutch, Austria was a major power, and then Germany, etc. Of course, well, all these powers were no longer major powers. Only 2 powers emerged after 1945, thus corroborating a prediction that had been made by the French de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, some 110 years earlier in his De la démocratie en Amérique, Democracy in America, a political theory or sociology essay that Tocqueville had published in the 1830s. He had imagined, anticipated, foreseen to some extent that the world would be divided into two camps or blocks led by, to quote Tocqueville, the Russians and the Americans. The Russians turned Soviets, but they were Russians or Soviet Russians. Look at Tocqueville, I quote you, there are at present time two great nations in the world which seem to tend towards the same end, though they started from different points, the Russians and the Americans. The American relies upon personal interest. These are the differences between the two. The American gives free scope to the common sense of the citizens. The Russians, on the other hand, the Russians centers all the authority in one single arm. It was the Tsar when he wrote his essay. It was Stalin when the Cold War began. The principal instrument of the former, of the American, is freedom. The principal instrument of the latter, of the Russian, is servitude. So their starting point is different, but their courses, though they are not the same, each of them, look at that, each of them seems to be marked out by the will of heaven to sway, to control the destinies of half the globe. So in the 1830s, Tocqueville imagined the world that will emerge 110 years later. The Cold War divided into two camps, two blocks, one controlled by the Soviets, the other by the Americans. That is to say, after 1945, there were only two powers, and this explains why they were called superpower. Superpowers, the term was coined by an American historian, William Fox, who published a book during World War II, 1944. This is entitled The Superpowers, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So in 1944, he still considered Great Britain to be a superpower, a major power, which he called the superpower. 2 years later, Great Britain was no more a superpower. Only two superpowers were left, the US and the USSR. And of course, it is this last characteristic, the fact that the Cold War was a bipolar confrontation between two superpowers, which explains the triumph of realism as the major approach, the major theoretical approach in the discipline of international relations during the two first decades of the Cold War. And I thus come back to the theoretical dimension of this chapter, to the rise and the success of realism, and to what the theory concretely consists in. Remember Edward Carr, what had he said? He had said, politics, to some extent, is always power politics. So politics first is power politics. That is to say, on the international political stage, every unit aims at doing what? Aims at imposing its will upon every other unit. This is the meaning of power. What is the meaning of power, ladies and gentlemen? The meaning of power is the capacity of an actor, in our case, a state, to impose its will upon another actor. A state is powerful and therefore is a major power if it is able to incite, to lead another state to do what it wants it to do. This is the meaning of power. It goes back to Max Weber's definition of power. The capacity to impose one's will upon somebody else. And power politics and international politics is always power politics. And the reason underlying this claim of the realists is the following one. In 1914, Great Britain, France, Imperial Germany, and Russia, and Austria wanted to impose their will upon the adversaries. During World War II, no more Imperial Germany, but Nazi Germany. No more Tsarist Russia, but Soviet Union. And we should add the US and Japan. After the end of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, Soviet Union and the USSR. To put it differently, for realists, the regimes of the different states changed. Their leaders were no longer the same. And yet, recurrently, regularly, hostility, rivalry, enmity, adversity characterized the relations among major powers. Therefore, politics, international politics, is always power politics. And this idea then, put forward by Edward Carr at the very end of the interwar period, will be spread, deepened and spread by an American author at the origin of realism, Hans Morgenthau. He is the most important realists, called the classical realists nowadays, because new versions of realism will emerge, notably in the 1970s and 1980s, neo-realism, and therefore what was called realism in the 40s and the 50s nowadays is called classical realism. This explains my title, the title of today's chapter number 3. So realists or classical realists dominated in the discipline during the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. Hans Morgenthau, we'll come back to him immediately. We can add other authors such as John Hertz, also an American, Henry Kissinger, who was a realist historian. He became also a practitioner. He became National Security Advisor of Nixon at the end of the 60s and Secretary of State at the beginning of the 70s. We should add Arnold Wolfers, also an American, and Raymond, the French theorist of international relations, also philosopher and sociologist. He, to some extent, is the major non-American realist or the major non-American classical realist. So let's have a look at Hans Morgenthau's contribution to the discipline of international relations, to the theory of international relations. His book, Politics Among Nations, published in 1948. Many editions were added ever since then, including after his death in 1980. Hans Morgenthau, to some extent, is the Pope of classical realism, and his Politics Among Nations is the Bible of classical realism. The objective pursued by Morgenthau was, I quote, to present a theory of international politics, a grand theory, international politics. Remember what we saw in our introduction, not international relations in general, international politics in the narrow meaning of international relations, that is to say, focusing on the questions of war and peace, of stability and instability, of conflict and cooperation and security. So the starting point of Hans Morgenthau's classical realism is very similar to the one of Edward Carr. Morgenthau also starts with criticizing idealism that had prevailed during the interwar period. Look at the slide. The two schools differ fundamentally in their conceptions of the nature of man, society, and politics. The one, that is to say, the idealist school believes that a rational and moral political order can be achieved. Yet now it is possible to it's possible for peace to prevail, for justice, for prosperity to prevail. This approach, the idealist approach, assumes the essential goodness of human nature. Men are good. And therefore, this approach trusts in education. Remember what we saw last week, in reform. Idealists were reformists. And then he opposes to this first idealist school another school, the second one. The other school believes that the world is the result of forces inherent in human nature. And he calls this approach realism, the theoretical concern with human nature as it actually is. And as we would like it to be. We would like human nature to be good, but actually human nature is not that good. To accept this, to analyze historic processes as they actually take place and not as we would like them to be, has earned the name of realism. I, Morgenthau, just as Edward Carr, I am a realist. I accept the reality as it really is. What then is the reality of politics, and more specifically international politics, consisting in? Yet, well, we have to look at the major cause of this reality. And according to Morgenthau's classical realism, the major cause of politics and therefore of international politics is located in human nature. Political realism believes that politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Human nature, according to Morgenthau, has not changed over the millennia since it was analyzed and described by past philosophers of ancient Greece, of ancient China, of ancient India. It is characterized, human nature, by a set of biopsychological drives common to all men. All men, ladies and gentlemen, according to Morgenthau, are characterized by the will to live, to propagate, and to dominate. To live, to propagate, and to dominate. I anticipate a little bit what we will see in another chapter. Feminist scholars nowadays will criticize this claim, equating human nature to the will to live, to propagate, to dominate. They will consider this approach to be a male, a masculine point of view. Also because Morgenthau uses the term common to all men, thus somehow forgetting or neglecting women. We'll come back to this point in the chapter concerns the chapter of radical or post-positivist approaches. According to Morgenthau, men, human nature is bad. Basically, this stems from Thomas Hobbes's philosophy, which we will see in another chapter too. So men try to impose their will, to dominate. States are sets of men, and therefore they too want to impose their will, and therefore international politics, look at the slide, like all politics, is by necessity power politics, almost the same sentence as Edward Carr during the interwar period. International politics is by necessity a power politics. So very concretely, what does that mean? How do states behave on the international scene when acting on the international scene, when undertaking actions, when taking decisions? Well, they try to defend and to promote their national interest. In terms of power, the main signpost that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interests, national interest, defined in terms of power. What do statesmen do? Well, they think and act in terms of interest defined as power. This interest creates that astounding continuity in foreign policy. That is to say, a state's foreign policy is characterized by continuity, whoever the statesman, because the statesman always will pursue the national interest. Maybe you listened to Joe Biden on August 31, 2021, so 4 to 5 months ago, when he justified America's decision to withdraw American soldiers from Afghanistan. How did he justify this decision? There were various arguments, but very regularly he appealed to the national interest of the US. Nowadays, the national interest of the US is to cope with the rise of China. to cope with Russia's assertiveness in Ukraine, etc. The national interest, the vital interest, the security interest of the US is no longer consisting in trying to establish a somehow democratic and working state in Afghanistan. So Biden appeals to the national interest, and to some extent he does corroborate Morgenthau's analysis. There is continuity in foreign policy because all the states, all the governments, whatever their motives, their preferences, whatever the intellectual and moral qualities of successful statesmen, all the states look for their national interest in terms of power. That is to say, their aim is to impose their will upon other powers. The US wants to go on being able to impose its will upon the Russians or the Chinese. According to Morgenthau, the fact that the states look for their national interests will end up indirectly, will end up favoring a kind of stability, a kind of stable international system. This may be somehow astonishing, given the egoistic behavior of every state, but it is perfectly logical. If all the states want to impose their will, this means that no state will accept any other state to be too powerful. And if then no state will be more powerful than any other state, there will be a balance of power. And this balance of power will permit stability to prevail, at least a temporary stability, not peace. We'll come back to this. There can be no peace strictly defined according to realists. There can only be stability or international order, more or less temporary, separating the wars of the past from the wars of the future. And we thus come to the general point of Morgenthau's classical realism, the general ideas, the major assumptions, the major hypotheses shared by all the classical realists. This then is the concrete substance of the classical realist approach. First of all, for classical realists, but it is true for realists in general, international politics is synonymous with power politics. Every state tries to impose its will upon every other state. In order to do so, states use two instruments: diplomacy, but also war. War is a rational means for states to obtain satisfaction. Rational, that is to say, when diplomacy fails, then it is normal for states to go to war, which amounts to saying that states never exclude the possibility of going to war, of using violence. And therefore, international politics is synonymous with a never-ending state of war. Remember what I said in the first chapter, in the introduction: anarchy, the absence of central authority above states, for realists is synonymous with a never-ending state of war. The idea is summed up in this first assumption. Since war is an instrument when diplomacy does not permit to obtain satisfaction, states always consider that they may have to go to war. And therefore, war always is possible. And therefore, peace, strictly defined, does not exist. Only stability, temporary stability, can exist, because sooner or later a war may break out. And, ladies and gentlemen, given that states all have military budgets, they all have troops, they all have armies to some extent, the realists are not that completely wrong when they claim that states never exclude to go to war. Otherwise, they would not have an army. So the empirical reality, to some extent, corroborates this first assumption of realism, according to which international politics is power politics, which can be violent. Second major assumption, according to realists, the major actors of international relations, and for them of international politics, the major actors are nowadays nation states, sovereign, independent nation states. That is to say, collective units, organized nowadays in the political form of nation states. These states are unitary actors. That is to say, they are personified in the statesman. And this statesman himself or herself, stateswoman, is rational. That is to say, his or her objective is to maximize the national interest, defined in terms of power, to maximize the national interest. If then only states are actors, this means that for realists, in general, and classical realists more specifically, international organizations such as the UN, non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, etc., are not actors. Individuals, multinational firms are not actors. According to realists, they only consider territorial, independent, sovereign nation states to be actors. So realism is a state-centered approach. Only states are actors. What is an actor? An actor is a unit whose behavior has an impact upon other units' behavior, directly or indirectly. So states are embodied in their statesmen, whose aim is to promote the national interest. This national interest, third assumption, is defined in terms of power, that is to say, on the basis of the overall distribution of power resources among major powers. Only external considerations are taken into account when it comes to define what the national interest consists in. Only external, that is to say, no internal dimension, which means very concretely that the national interest of a state in its foreign policy behavior is different from and superior to private interests of the citizens living in a country. There is a radical separation between international dimension and the domestic dimension. A statesman, when dealing on the international scene, does not take into account private interests. According to realists, we will see that liberals have a different analysis. And what's more, when a statesman decides to do this or that in order to promote, defend, satisfy the national interest, they do not take into account the public opinion. The public opinion of average citizens like you and me. Why? Because according to realists, the public opinion does not know what the national interest consists in. To some extent, the public opinion is stupid. Only the statesman is rational enough to know what the national interest consists in. And last assumption, ladies and gentlemen, in the realist approach of international politics, there is no progress possible towards peace. There is a never-ending state of war. The only possibility is to achieve stability or order, international order, during a specific period of time, that is to say, temporarily. Sooner or later, a war will break out. So only stability is possible thanks to a balance of power. That is to say, as long as major powers have as many resources as other major powers, no superpower is more powerful than all the other ones. Temporarily, such a stability may prevail, but no peace is possible, no progress towards an end of history, which will be the liberal claim. We'll see this in another chapter. There is no end of history, there is no progress towards peace, and international organizations or international law, etc., have absolutely no impact. They do not contribute to permit peace to prevail. So, ladies and gentlemen, this realist theory is, of course, synonymous with a very, very pessimistic outlook. And I come back to my basic assumption, to my starting point. I consider theories to reflect somehow a historical context. Well, the context of Morgenthau was a very dark context. Morgenthau, in his life, had known as a child, World War I, or as a teenager, World War I, then the Great Depression of 29, then World War II, the Holocaust, and the outbreak of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. He could not be optimistic given such a background. And to some extent, his theory, therefore, is very close to the philosophy of those classical thinkers who in the past had put forward a similar analysis, though less scientific or less rigorous. Because these philosophers also in the past had been living in very dark periods of history. Thucydides, the Greek historian who had lived during the Peloponnesian War, Machiavelli, who had lived during the wars of the Italian Renaissance, opposing notably François Ier, the French king, to the Spanish Habsburgs, Thomas Hobbes, who had witnessed both the 30 Years' War and also the English or the British Civil War, the English Civil War. He published his Leviathan in 1651, and last but not least, Clausewitz, who had been living during Napoleon's wars and who published his own war 50 years after Napoleon's defeat. So if you go back to the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, we saw this. The Cold War was characterized both by periods of tensions and periods of dialogue. But the realists only saw the periods of crisis. They saw the nuclear arms race. They did not see the arms control process or the disarmament between, for instance, Reagan and Gorbachev. And they saw the regularly outbreaking crisis, rather than the capacity of the two superpowers to limit the crisis, to resolve them, and not to escalate into a hot war. The Cold War remained cold, it never became hot. What does that mean? This means that the realists focused on one specific aspect of the reality. When they claim we have to accept reality as it really is, this is Edward Carr's analysis, the reality as it really is, and not as we would like it to be. The same is true for Morgenthau, human nature as it is, historic processes as they actually take place. We have to admit, and they should admit too, that they focus only on one specific reality. But this is what characterizes a theory. A theory is a kind of looking glass. And looking glasses and lenses see some specific characteristics of reality, not all the specific points of reality. Theories focus on some realities they consider to be more important than other ones. And given the then never-ending risks of a war breaking out between the Soviets and the Americans, they were successful in the discipline of international relations. So realists were successful thanks to the refutation of the idealists' optimistic outlook. The idealists had been belied by the Great Depression of 29, by the outbreak of World War II, by the outbreak of the Cold War. The realists, however, were also successful, at least the last point of today's class, because their theory corresponded to what American policymakers needed after World War II, what they needed to do to explain to the American public opinion their new foreign policy behavior. You may know that when the Americans became independent in 1776, thanks to their war of independence, the American Revolution against the British, they claimed to be different from the European powers. They claimed to be the beacon of humanity, the city upon the hill. They said that they would not practice power politics as the then European powers, notably the French, the British, and the Spaniards, were practicing in Europe and in their colonial empires. So Americans claimed that they were characterized by what they called American exceptionalism. Now, what is America doing after 45? It no longer practices its traditional isolationist policy that had characterized American foreign policy from the very beginning up to World War I and even to some extent up to Pearl Harbor. America had been attacked in 1941 by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. So the American statesmen, Roosevelt, and then Truman, Eisenhower, etc., all the following American presidents came to the conclusion our security is at stake all over the world. We can no longer afford to merely focus on the Western Hemisphere. We have to maintain our troops in Europe to contain the Soviets, in the Far East, Japan, South Korea, to contain the Soviets, the Chinese, the North Koreans, etc., etc. We can no longer do what we used to do. So the public opinion in the US was confronted to a change in America's foreign policy. And of course, the American leaders could not say, we are no longer exceptional. We are no longer different from the Europeans. They had to look for another explanation. And this other explanation precisely was provided by realism. Realism claims that international politics is power politics. The conclusion that can be drawn is the following one. We Americans have to practice power politics. We can no longer afford to be different because our national interest is at stake all over the world. So realism, look at the slide, provided what American leaders were looking for, an intellectual compass, an intellectual explanation, which justified America's global involvement on the world political scene. American GIs were stationed everywhere in the world. American military bases were present all over the world. Realism rationalized the accumulation of power, the techniques of intervention, the methods of containment against the Soviets. It explained it to the idealist American public opinion, those who had been raised with the belief that Americans were different. It could explain to the American idealists why international politics does not permit pure goodwill to prevail. We are different, but we are attacked. So we must defend ourselves. We too must practice power politics because international politics by definition is power politics. So realism, the last sentence in the quote, provided what was necessary. In global terms, in general terms, ladies and gentlemen, a theory in international relations, in the discipline of international relations, is successful because it explains what is going on the international scene, of course. It is relevant to describe and to explain what is going on, but the theory is also successful because of its political utility to some extent, because it is useful for some politicians, for some decision makers, which means that the theory is successful as long also as it corresponds to a kind of intellectual mood, to a kind of historic context, historic climate, Zeitgeist is the German term, which means that in the case of the historical context changing, and therefore the intellectual interpretation also changing, it is likely that a theory declines and that another one emerges. This is what will happen roughly 20 years after the end of World War II. That is to say, classical realism prevailed during 2 full decades before new theories emerged, triggered notably by the Cuban Missile Crisis and its consequences. And we will see the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the evolution of international relations theories, the emergence of middle range theory focusing on foreign policy analysis in our chapter 4. Next week, thank you very much for attending today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you a great day and hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.